Hello there. In this video we're going to be looking at 6 of the best villains Star Trek has ever made. Now, Star Trek not well known for making some of the best villains on TV. In fact, a lot of them are pretty lackluster. But I've sifted, I've thought, I've pondered. The 6 that I think are pretty damn good. There are more than 6, but I'm trying to go with 6 of the best. Before we get started though, if you like this video or any others on this channel, please like, share, subscribe, maybe head over to my other channel, Nerd.World Films, do the same over there. And with that said, let's get started. Okay, so in the number 6 spot we've got the Borg Queen. A little bit of a cheat here. The Queen isn't technically an individual, so she's not a specific villain really, but she's the face of the Borg. A bit like how they wanted Locutus to be the face of the Borg, but she's not really an individual. So I'd say a bit of a cheat, but still was an awesome character to introduce into First Contact. She was a menace, a physical representation of the Borg collective, so basically evil personified. Malevolence in its purest form. The Borg Queen was effectively the mouthpiece of the Borg, a central processing unit for the entire collective. Now that includes trillions of drones, millions of ships, millions of assimilated systems, to which the singular Queen was in charge of. So all the bad stuff the Borg ever did, the assimilation of the Elorians, species 116 invading fluidic space, she was the collective will, the desire, the design behind all of the Borg's worst actions. The use of Seven of Nine as an infiltrator, the assimilation of Jean-Luc Picard to be a voice, a conduit between the human race and the Borg to better facilitate and more efficiently assimilate humans into the collective. Everything the Borg did that was ever bad could be traced to her, and the Borg did a lot of bad things. Can't deny it. The Queen, though, as a character, was fascinating. She was sexual, she was malevolent, she was callous, she would graft organic tissue onto Data in an attempt to seduce him to wanting to become a Borg, a synthetic life form. She effectively would dissect her own drones in order to root out those drones that still had an inkling of individuality, because no deviation from the norm could be permitted amongst the Borg. If you were Borg, you were Borg. You didn't get to have dreams or thoughts or aspirations or desires of your own. You had metal thoughts forever. So, Queen, pretty fascinating villain. In at number 5, got probably a little more of a less popular one, but really, where would Voyager have been without him? We got Maj Jal Kulla, the first Maj of the Kazon Nistrum, one of the various sects that made up the Kazon Collective. Now, the Kazon were kind of a pseudo-Klingon race, introduced into Voyager, meant to be a more serious antagonist and threat, but really, sometimes they were a bit probably overstated in their power. I mean, they were decades, if not centuries, behind Starfleet. Their ships never really should have been a threat to Voyager, just been able to get through the shields. But despite their technological inferiority and apparent physical and intellectual inferiority to humans and the Federation, thanks partially to being underestimated, Kulla was able to pose a significant threat. He was able to unify the other Kazon sects, sort of, against Voyager. He was able to overpower it at one point, with help of course, but he was able to do it. The Kazon were often underestimated as they were probably viewed as primitive and inferior, but they had managed to overthrow their enslavers. They had managed to build themselves a sort of pseudo-empire out there in the Delta Quadrant to turn themselves into a pretty much a superpower in that region. And Kulla had schemed and crafted his way to being the leader of a Kazon sect, which in Kazon society made him the equivalent of a general or a chieftain of some description, as they were kind of a divided society. Now, the inner workings of Kazon society was never overly explored, but they had to be more fundamentally complex than what they're superficially seen as. So despite his arrogance and despite his chauvinistic attitude, Color was a threat to Voyager. He was able to turn the Kazon into little, who were basically just pirates and a nuisance, into a genuine threat and a menace. For multiple seasons, they pursued Voyager under his leadership. They pursued it across sectors of space. They killed members of the crew, they captured the ship, stole technology, turned races against them, played a game of basically psychological warfare and cat and mouse with Voyager, which they did very successfully. So, as I said, where would Voyager have been in the early seasons without the Kazon? Without the face of an enemy? Which I thought Color did pretty well, and despite the sort of, once again, pseudo-Klingon appearance of the race and their obvious chauvinistic attitudes towards women, they made sometimes compelling villains, and Color was probably one of the most fleshed out, if not the most fleshed out Kazon we ever saw on screen. In at our number 4 spot is the amazing and Shakespearean General Chang, portrayed by Christopher Plummer, who can't praise this guy enough. I mean, growing up, Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, maybe after Wrath of Khan, probably rivaling it depending on my mood really. 2 of my favourite films in Star Trek. They're probably the best 2 of the original 6 Star Trek movies. Fight me. General Chang, very compelling villain. Very nuanced, very somewhat super villainy, sometimes a little cheesy, but very cool. And to be the gravitas that Christopher Plummer brings to that character, it just makes it so amazing. And the idea of him, he's a Klingon patriot, but he's willing to assassinate his own chancellor to further his goals. His career, his life has been spent fighting the Federation, building up the Klingon defenses, planning invasions, and then for them to turn around and go, nah, we're going to have peace. It seemed very un-Klingon. To him, the Chancellor had betrayed the Klingon Empire. The Klingons, with the destruction of Praxis, they should have invaded the Federation, thrown their resources at conquest and taking new territory in order for the loss of Praxis to be negated. Not bow to the Federation and basically disarm and retreat behind their border and be probably reliant on the Federation's trade of those resources rather than simply taking them with Klingon hands and Klingon force and grit and spit. And he found it offensive, and developed, especially by his house or by one of his allied houses perhaps, was a super advanced prototype cloaking device that allowed his ship, his flagship bird of prey, to fire its torpedoes while cloaked. Now, rather than use this against perhaps the Klingon Empire's real enemies like the Romulans, or even perhaps directly against the Federation in a war, he would use this technology to assassinate the Chancellor of the Klingon Empire, Chancellor Gorkon, a good man amongst many Klingons. Now, the bird of prey may have not been properly used, but in his mind, he was doing the right thing. He was saving his people from becoming puppets of the Federation. And there were those on the Federation's side that wanted the same thing. They wanted conflict with Klingons. They hated them. As Kirk would put it, let them die. And if Captain Kirk could be that angry, probable that many other people were blinded by rage and fear and centuries of mistrust and Cold War against an enemy they were just simply used to fighting. I mean, after all, it was 2 humans that would board the Chancellor's flagship and were the ones who pulled the trigger. They were the ones who assassinated him. Not Klingons and the bird of prey, but humans. Chang was the puppet master behind all of this, getting both sides to play off each other, seed the doubt between 2 powers, that the other side was conspiring against them, when in truth both sides were conspiring against the middle. And although ultimately he was defeated, he went down fighting. He went down like a true Klingon. In at our number 3 spot is the even more brilliant Seska, played by Martha Hackett. Definitely my favourite villain from Voyager. She was the one that was given the most character development, the most depth. She was the woman behind the power, the woman behind the conspiracy, the woman behind everything. She was the woman behind Chakotay, the woman behind Color. She was the one who helped the Nystrom take Voyager. She helped them devise tactics to conceal their ships, develop new technologies and tactics that could combat Federation technology using the relatively inferior Kazon technology that was at their disposal. She would give birth to the future leader of the Nystrom. She was a Cardassian spy who infiltrated the Maquis, a Maquis/Cardassian spy who came aboard Voyager and would betray them at every opportunity in order to further her goals, her agenda. As she put it, if this was a Cardassian vessel, we'd have already been home, to paraphrase her. She would try to use Chakotay's DNA to impregnate herself in order to play both sides. If things didn't go well with the Kazon, she knew that Chakotay had never abandoned his child and he'd come for her. If that didn't work, convincing Color that the child was his would mean that the Kazon would always look after her, and gave her a position of power and a seat next to the throne of the Nystrom. The only woman really to hold any position of authority amongst the Kazon, as women were generally viewed as inferior to men in Kazon culture, and if they held any positions aboard the starships at all, it probably would have been low level, like cooks or the captain's woman, something like that. They wouldn't have held particularly prominent roles particularly in the military, if there were any at all. The odd Kazon woman was seen on a planet that the Kazons were living on, but generally there were none seen aboard their ships, Seska being the only exception, albeit she was a Cardassian, pretending to be a Bajor and pretending to be a Maquis, and then pretending to be a Starfleet officer. As I said, brilliant character, very well played, and a recurring villain who comes back in later seasons, and she's still brilliant. And definitely a highlight of every episode that she was in. In and our number 2 spot is Khan. This may be a controversial number 2, but he wasn't in enough, but what he was in, he made a hell of an impact. A genetically augmented human. By augment, there is a difference between genetically engineered and augment in Star Trek. A genetically engineered person would be someone like Dr. Bashir, who was born normal to two perfectly normal parents, and then had genetic gene therapy and gene resequencing to enhance natural abilities, hand-eye coordination, intelligence, yada yada. Whereas an augment is a composite of people. They have taken the best bits of the best mind, the best physicality of certain other individuals, combined them into a new embryo and then grown it like a test tube baby with similar genetic enhancements and augmentations to make it a physically superior human specimen with an average of 5 times the strength of a human of proportionally similar size, twice the intellect quite happily, greater reflexes, hand-eye coordination, stamina, longevity, lifespan, everything. And Khan was considered one of the greatest of the Supermen, one of the greatest intellects of his time, one of the greatest military strategists, and he demonstrates that despite some limitations of not really understanding sometimes the three-dimensional nature of space warfare, as he was obviously would have been used to combat on the ground and controlling people and armies rather than space navies. But he did pretty damn well, considering he came from a 20th century level of technology. Him and his people were able to pretty quickly adapt to 23rd century Federation technology. And they did it well, capturing the Reliant, taking control of the Genesis device, before that attempting to seize control of the Enterprise. It was effectively a failure of the Federation to not realize that SETI Alpha 5 had basically its ecosystem had collapsed. As Khan put it, they never came back to check on him. I quite rightly had a grievance about that. He was what he was. He was a product of his age. He was a product of his time. And yeah, he'd done some bad stuff in the past, but Starfleet decided to let him go. They decided to put him down on that planet, seed a colony. And years later, the Reliant comes by deciding, SETI Alpha 4, that's a good place to terraform. Look, should we drop in on SETI Alpha 5? There's people living there after all. I mean, they're not part of the Federation, but they are human-ish. Augments being sort of evolved, artificially evolved, and evolved humans. Nah, we won't check in on them, just leave them to it. And that kind of goes wrong for them. But from the episode Space Seed right through the Wrath of Khan, he was a very compelling villain. And even the portrayal of him by Benedict Cumberbatch in Into Darkness isn't terrible, although I didn't want him to be Khan in that film. I didn't like that J.J. Abrams just lied to everyone about that. It's not going to be Khan. I won't do that. What he could have done, in my headcanon, I prefer to think, is that dude was lying. He wasn't really Khan. He was just one of Khan's soldiers. But to protect Khan, he said, "No, I'm Khan. Yeah, I'm Khan. I'm not just one of his lackeys. I'm actually Khan." And in my headcanon, that's what I prefer him to be. I don't want him to be Khan. I want him to just be another human augment, because they're all pretty much Supermen, so it wouldn't have really mattered. They could have easily made him just one of the other Supermen from the ship, from the Botany Bay, but they had to go with Khan. They had to do that. Bloody J.J. Abrams. Okay, on to the number 1 spot. Now, this may be kind of sad, but I genuinely agonized over who should be number 1 on my list, Khan or Gul Dukat. And I settled on Gul Dukat because I think Cardassians make great villains, and he was a sympathetic villain. Khan wasn't exactly two-dimensional. He wasn't someone you thought, nah, he's just a villain. He's just a cartoonish character, like a lot of Star Trek villains. I'm looking at you, Nero. But he was very fleshed out. Gul Dukat was sympathetic. Sometimes you even thought he was going to become a good man. He was a patriot to his people, although he was very self-motivated. He fell to anarchy, fell to chaos, he fell to the Par Wraiths. But he always felt that in some way he was actually doing good. It was so deluded. He wasn't. He was a warmonger. He was an occupier of Bajor. He didn't want to admit it, but he hated Bajorans, but also loved them. And it was a weird combination of those two factors that made up his personality. But his arrogance, his ego, was what drove him, his ambition. But everything from the Bajoran occupation to switching sides during the Cardassian Civil War, to working with the Federation against the Maquis, to joining the Dominion, to abandoning the Dominion, to worshipping the Par Wraiths, and in his vendetta against Captain Sisko, he saw as his mortal enemy, as the emissary of the Prophets, as he was the emissary of the Par Wraiths. He was the most, without a doubt, fleshed out villain that Star Trek ever had. A villain from Season 1 to Season 7. He was sometimes on top, sometimes he was defeated, but always charming, charismatic, intelligent, forceful. In many ways, he was the mirror image of Captain Sisko. He was everything Sisko was and everything Sisko wasn't. And he represented everything the Federation shouldn't be. Selfish, ambitious, cruel, egotistical, malevolent. He loved his family, but he could equally have stabbed his own child. He mourned the loss of his daughter, but he tried to kill her. He loved his wife, but he kept Bajoran sex slaves. He, even amongst his Par Wraith worshippers, took advantage of his position and got one of them pregnant, and then claimed it was the divine will of the Par race that they had transformed the baby to be in his image, that it should be pure Bajoran. He was not a good man in any stretch of the imagination, and at the end he showed his true colours, despite some pretensions of nobility and honour, none of which he truly had. He was one of Star Trek's greatest villains, and always very likeable, and the Mark Alamo, the man that literally defined how Cardassians could look because of the length of his neck, which is an interesting behind the scenes where they sort of collar that the Cardassians all had was so well defined because Mark Alema was such a naturally long neck that the makeup artist had to make this thing really stick out, and this kind of became a thing with Cardassians. He defined the look of the people from his first appearance in The Next Generation as a different character right through to his end in the fire caves on Bajor. Definitely the best, most compelling villain I can think of in Star Trek. If anyone out there disagrees, tell me. If there's any villains you think I should have included in this list, any characters you think were better than Dukat, should I have made Khan number 1? Let me know. I may do another video like this in the future. I had a few more contenders for this list, but I wanted to keep it short. By short, I think this video's already hit 20 minutes, so with that said, we're going to make this the end. If you liked it, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you've made it this far, and that's brilliant. And with that said, thank you and bye bye.